Okay, exactly. Okay, good evening. We'll get underway. As you can see, the name of the series is about Baltimore's Jews and Judaisms. And that's a particular title I picked because you can do one of these regular history things in every show, when it was built and who was the rabbi and president and the sisterhood and all that business, or what neighborhood. I'm interested more in broad trends. And especially, I'm interested in the religious trends, or at least the Jewish cultural trends, and Baltimore's seen them all. That's what makes it interesting to me. So we'll pick up where we started last time, but again, tonight is called The Invasion of Germany, the Age of the South Germans, as you'll see, which is being sponsored by the Layman's, by Dr. and Mrs. Robert Layman. I didn't know this. They came in between 1829 and 1840s. That's a long time ago, okay? Where I used to come from, they call people like Goyim, you know. Yeah. But this is from the first wave, and look at it, and they're still Jewish, and they're still everything today. So that's the real tribute. But let's get into this. I just want to do the formalities and thank the shul. If anybody's here from the shul for sponsoring and letting us host it, to the rabbi and all the officers, and to the Rabbi Lehman. You were with me when we went that one time to the Sher Theater, the old one downtown. I have to do that again, but it wasn't easy to get in. It was not easy to get in. And what do you call it? And by the way, they apologized to him because they had to fill up the mikveh. Do you remember that? Yeah. We're talking about on McCullough Street downtown. Anyhow, so, and finally, I want to thank the tech team as always for being, they really deserve the applause, okay? And we'll jump into it. As we saw last time, American Jewry was tiny in the early days of the Republic. I told you it was like 2,500 Jews here, and then maybe a little bit more, basically. Now, that's not a bad thing, because of the 2,500 Jews, there was no anti-Semitism, very little. Most people didn't meet a Jew, right? And the ones we met during the times, that they met in times of Washington and Adams and Jefferson and so forth, were probably pretty doggone Americanized, okay? Like the people I spoke about last time, yes, they came from somewhere else, but they anglicized, and even though many of them were what we call today Shomer Shabbos and kept kosher and that sort of thing, but you can see from the pictures of them, they didn't flaunt it on the street. They didn't walk around with a strime and a kapota. So, there might have been a little bit, okay? Let's go to the next one. Might have been a little bit. There was a Jew at that time, Mordechai Noah, and he was actually appointed by President Madison to be a kind of a U.S. diplomat in the Barbary pirates in the coast. I think he was in Tunis, if I remember correctly. I did a podcast the other day. The Houthis are nothing new. The Arab countries in the Mediterranean at that time, for hundreds of years, they had the Corsairs, and they simply raided European ships and killed everybody or took them as slaves. Englishmen, Frenchmen, Spanish, Italian, you name it. They even raided Connecticut, believe it or not, in the colonial times. And nothing you could do about it until, and they had American prisoners, like Trump has now got that guy out of Hamas. Nothing has changed, because in the time of Washington and as late as Madison, you had American hostages or slaves. And one of the jobs of the diplomats was try to get them out. And Washington Adams paid them off. That was the policy at that time. If you paid them off, then they would leave your ships alone. But Jefferson had a different attitude. He created the United States Navy and the U.S. Marine Corps, and they went to war. Those who are from Baltimore will remember the name of Stephen Decatur, like Decatur High. And he was a famous naval hero that time, fighting against the Arabs and the Barbary pirates. He burned their ships in the harbors and things like that. And there were other guys. So part of that was that you need American diplomats to go to Morocco, Algiers, Tunisia, and Tripoli in Libya and try to negotiate with these rulers and things like that. And they sent a Jew, one of them. And that's when Madison was the president and he was the Secretary of State. And then they fired him. And he said it was anti-Semitism and so forth. It might have been, might not have been, whatever the case is. It was a little bit of anti-Semitism, but nothing serious, not really. And especially you can't compare this to what was going on in Europe, okay? So, I mean, in 1815, you had the Congress of Vienna. The Jews of Europe, for the most part, had been given civil rights by the French Revolution. And then when the French Revolution conquered most of Europe, which is what happened between 1790 and 1810, the French conquered most of Europe, Italy, Germany, Spain even, believe it or not, and things like that. They gave the Jews civil rights. But when Napoleon was overthrown, and Napoleon was an anti-Semite, don't get me wrong, but nevertheless, they had their civil rights. And when the Congress of Vienna met afterwards over the defeat of Napoleon, they pulled the civil rights, okay? So all of a sudden you went back to the old system, which you're Jewish, you can't do this, you must do that, this. They didn't bring back the ghettos except in Rome, you see? So it was a little bit of a better, but like in Frankfurt, there wasn't a ghetto anymore. But still, there were 1,000 laws against the Jews, which is a very important part of our story tonight. Even after the Congress of Vienna, there were still all kinds of legal disabilities and worse. You couldn't get married in Bohemia and Bavaria. One called Familientengesetz, the Familient laws. You see, you don't want the Jews to breed too much, like Pharaoh talked about in Egypt. And therefore, in the Austrian Empire and in the Kingdom of Bavaria, which is a big part of southern Germany, that's where all the Baltimore Jews will come from, they still had, till 1848, only one kid in the family can get married, and the others can't. And if you don't like it, either convert or drop dead or leave. So we're going to be talking about a period when a lot of them say, I'm leaving, okay? And if they have laws like that, imagine the residency restrictions. Couldn't live in, let's say in Bavaria, you couldn't live in Munich, can't live in Nuremberg, you're not allowed. You had to live in villages outside. And 100 other sorts of things. So, in fact, the period after 1815 is called the Age of Metternich, who was the famous Austrian chancellor, and they were consciously reactionary. And he said, our policy is reactionary. We want to undo as much as we can the French Revolution, and we don't want to give the Jews any rights. We do not want to do that. So life was not great in Central Europe, in Bavaria and Bohemia. Today, this is the Kingdom of Bohemia, Bohemia Moravia. Today it's called the Czech Republic. Okay? Czech Republic is the old Kingdom of Bohemia Moravia. And next to it over here is Bavaria. A lot of your so-called German Jews that have come to this country in the 1800s are really from Bohemia. Okay? Like Isaac Mayer Wise and people like that. And a lot of them be from Moravia, but they're all German-speaking. You get it? They were provinces of the Austrian Empire, and the Czech culture didn't have a Trias Amesim yet. That was later in the 1800s. And so they call themselves German Jews, you see? Now, this is how it went. Now, let's look at some statistics to see idea what's going to happen. Until 1820, there wasn't much immigration in this country because of the European wars. I told you the other day, America became a country in 1783. George Washington started out with the constitutional system in 1789. But in that year came the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille, and then 26 years of continual war. So that means you couldn't go in the high seas, because if Team A will sink your ship or something, Team B will do so. I think many will remember from high school, why was there War of 1812? Because the British used to take American ships and impress the people and use them as sailors whether they wanted to or not, and all kind of things like that. So it wasn't safe. So there wasn't much immigration into America during these years. I think in George Washington's time, total population, all 13 states, was about 3 million. And probably a few years later, it wasn't much more than that. But that's going to change. And plus, when the wars were over, 1815, there was a big depression, economic depression in this country, if you know, because of the aftermath of the war and things like that. So don't move to America, there's no jobs. But then, the depression went away, as it used to happen, boom and bust, they called it, bust and boom. And then, over the next 50, 60 years, 7 million Europeans move here. So that's a game changer, okay? Between 1825 and 1880. 7 million. Mostly from Western Europe, England, France, Germany, Holland, Scandinavia, and so forth, those types. They include between 200 and 250,000 German Jews, as we would call them today. So the 7 million would be something like 6.8 million non-Jews and 200.2 million Jews. So all of a sudden, America went from a country where the whole doggone thing from top to bottom was 2,500 people to 250,000. You see? That made a big difference. There was 250,000 Jews here. That's a big increase. And this will be reflected in the city of Baltimore. Okay? So let's look at some statistics. Yeah, I told you, in George Washington time, it's 3 million, then it went to 4.5. And then, so it's not a lot, the increase. Then the 6 million, and 10 years later, 8 million. And then the 10 million, so it's 2 million growing every year, every decade. But all of a sudden, they grow by 15, and by 20, in other words, 5 million, then by 7 million a year, 7, and so forth. So this population numbers, and I'm talking about the white people here, they wouldn't let any black people into America except as slaves. So they weren't counted, right? These figures are for the white. And it goes to show you America was a country which was not only territorially expanding, but population was expanding. So what that means in real life is, wherever you live, all the time, new people are showing up. Maybe not on your block, maybe yes on your block. But there's just new people coming here all the time. America at that time craved white immigration to fill up the country because Jefferson did the Louisiana Purchase and later did more, and you want to fill it up. Assuming, of course, that the immigrants want to assimilate, and they did. So all your Germans, your French, your Dutch came here with the idea to Americanize. They knew they'll never speak good English, but their kids will. And by the grandchildren, they'll forget the first language. That's what happened to the Germans here and to all the others, and to the Jews. The older generation will talk Yiddish, for example, but not the grandchildren. So America was the land of freedom. It really was. In Europe, they're going through a reaction. You have royal dictatorships, despotisms. Here it's total freedom. It's the land of pure capitalism, okay? Grover Cleveland, who was later the president, he had the famous inaugural address. He said like this: in this country, the people are supposed to support the government. The government is not supposed to support the people, right? Try saying that today. And what he meant by that was, this is you sink or swim on your own. In other words, we want everybody from Europe to come over here, but you're on your own. If you make it, you make it, and God bless you. If you sink and you starve to death, heck with you. There wasn't Social Security, wasn't unemployment insurance, there wasn't welfare, none of social safety nets, and all that kind of business. Understand? So that means that overwhelmingly, the type of people, including Jews, who will move here are going to be younger, more hardy, ready to work their heads off, right? Because otherwise it's not a friendly environment. You understand? These Jews moved all over the country, whatever the U.S. was at that time. But we're going to concentrate on Baltimore, which was one of the largest cities, I think the third largest city in America, and had one of the most dynamic economies, because first of all, you got the Chesapeake Bay, and second of all, you got the B&O Railroad, which was constructed at that time, which connected the East Coast, with what was called that time the West, which you today call, the Midwest. So naturally, that's a place you want to settle, especially if you're Jewish. There's economic opportunities there. Also, Baltimore was one of the leading port cities, so a lot of Jews and non-Jews, where'd they get off the boat? In Baltimore, not in Ellis Island. That didn't exist. And so, get off the boat, maybe I can make a job here. You see? So look at Baltimore's numbers. We were 6,000 in the time of the American Revolution. Then 50 years later or so, 6 to 45,000. And then a few years later to 210,000. Then to 330, and by 1900, say 500,000. What's the population of Baltimore today? 500,000. So we went up, now we've gone down. That's part of the urban decline, okay? But in the 1800s, it wasn't like that. More people are coming all the time. And by the way, if you want to open a business, it will not be hard to find employees. It will not be hard to find workers. You understand? Because everybody needs a job. And there's no such thing as a welfare department. It didn't exist. I would say that the 1820s is when things started happening Jewishly here in Baltimore, because a small but steady number of Jews started moving here from Holland and from Bavaria, Dutch Jews, South German Jews. So the Jewish community grew to be more than it was what we talked about last time, which was just a handful of families, the Eddings and the Cohns and the Russells and a few others. The Jewish community grew to be more than that tiny handful of elite, wealthy families. It grew to nearly 200 Jews. Oh my God, right? Oh my goodness. And I'm sure people said, this city has too many Jews, right? I have to tell you this. When I was a kid, they once had, long ago, CBS News, Walter Cronkite, anti-Semitism in America, right? And whoever it was talked to a lady in Louisville, Kentucky, a non-Jewish lady. How many Jews in America? 50 million. He said, wait a minute. What would you say, miss, if I told you that actually there are not 50 million Jews in America? Actually, there are 5 million. They must all live in Louisville. Understand? So when it grew to 200 Jews, now the newcomers who got off the boat, they lived in a poor section of town. Not like the Eddings and the Cohns who lived in Charleston, Saratoga, which was high class, okay? So already in the 1820s, there were two Jewish Baltimores. These and these, the rich and the poor, the ones that lived relatively north and the ones that lived relatively south in the harbor area, which was a slum and a half and so forth. Politically, during the 1820s, they passed the Jew Bill, which gave the Jews civil rights in state of Maryland. And the Eddings and the company, who were the elites, were elected to the city council, which began a long tradition, as I mentioned the other day. We've got 200 years on the Baltimore City Council of Shomer Shabbos. Because this guy was a Shomer Shabbos, very Reuben Edding. So with civil rights came the desire to build a synagogue. Now that it was legal, until they passed the Jewish Rights Bill, the Jew Bill, you couldn't have a church unless the state gives you a charter, and they won't give anything non-Christian a charter. A church, quote unquote, a Jewish church, was the visible sign of a religious community. And in America, it's as close as you could get to establishing a kehillah. Not exactly like in Europe, they had a formal structure and all the rest of it. But in this country, the closest you could get to have a shul, right? A building which belongs to the tzibur, a symbol of an actual community. So imagine, until 1830 or so, there's no such thing as a shul. You can dominate all you want in somebody's living room. That's okay. It's a free country. But that doesn't feel the same way. The problem was, what kind of a shul? The elites wanted Spanish Portuguese, right? That's what they were used to. But the newcomers, they want Ashkenaz, one form or another, understandably. So in other words, the old system that I described, or tried to, where one by one a German Jewish family would come over here and join an existing synagogue, which was Spanish Portuguese, in New York, in Charleston, in Savannah, in Richmond, in Newport, Philly. That system now broke down because too many are coming to assimilate into the old reality. There's a whole bunch of German Jews coming up here and say, what kind of davening is this? Shema Yisrael and all the rest of it. You know, that's not how we do it in Germany. That's not how we do it in Holland. And so they wanted to have their own kind of shul. This happened all across the country, right? It's an interesting trend. That's why they broke away in New York from the, from the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue, Sheretz Israel, and they made B'nai Jeshurun and Anshe Chesed. These are big synagogues today, not Orthodox, but they were originally. By the 1820s, there were enough German and Dutch Jews coming here that they formed an Ashkenaz minyan in private homes. This was different than the Portuguese minyan. So it was a real Jewish community with two shuls. There's 20 Jews in town, and this is the shul I daven in, and this is the shul I went to step foot in. Okay? This is the one my way, and this is the other way. There was even a shochet and a mole here. 200, that's a big community in those days. Before long, the Ashkenaz minyan concentrated in the East Baltimore home of a guy named Zalman Ryan, who was a German Jew who immigrated here in George Washington's time, had moved to Richmond was successful in business and attained middle-class status in Richmond, and then moved to Baltimore in his old age to be with his kids. And he was Mr. Yiddishkeit in Baltimore. So who was it? Mrs. Benjamin was just telling me, this is, you know where this is. This is where they have the cemetery downtown of the Eddings and the Cones. Meaning, this is the original people in Baltimore and the elites. Now this is on North Avenue, like Pennsylvania. And where's that?
North in Pennsylvania.
North in Pennsylvania, exactly. It's where the riots were. They burned down if anybody's in Baltimore, remember they burned down a couple years ago that pharmacy? That's across the street, okay? And it's got a brick wall around it now. And at that time, that was bearing all the way out because they were all downtown, right? All the way out. North Avenue is like the city limits. But he's there. You see Zalman Rhein. And he was what you would call the unofficial rabbi or something like that. If you could read Hebrew and knew a little bit more than that, you were like the rabbi. By 1830, the Ashkenaz Minyan incorporated as a legal church, the state of Maryland. In other words, a synagogue, which they call Nidchei Yisrael. That's a very Sephardic type name. There's a lot of Nidchei Yisraels around the world, Spanish, Portuguese. The wanderers of Israel, right? You understand. It took the Maryland legislature 3 years to approve. So entrenched was the Christian conservatism over here. So they appealed to them for a charter, 1827, it took 3 years. At that time, Reform Judaism was just starting in Germany. It hadn't hit America yet, and it wouldn't until the late 1840s. So regardless of how observant somebody was or wasn't, the German Jews davened in Orthodox minyans and shuls because that's what there was. They wouldn't know anything different. Starting 1830, considerably more Jews started settling in Baltimore. Same thing with the non-Jews. 1830 comes the big wave of immigration, turning it into a relatively large Jewish community indeed. Most of them came from the Kingdom of Bavaria in South Germany. So Germany used to have the different German states and kingdoms, and most of your Baltimore families that go way back when are from that area. And so the Neubergers, for example, things like they're all from the Bavaria type area. So there's a difference between South Germany and North Germany, but it wouldn't matter to you all. Now, they left precisely because of the screwball gezeras that I talked about before, like residence restrictions and marriage restrictions, okay? So let's go to the next one. Yeah, here's an old professor of mine, James Harris, passed away not long ago. He wrote the book on how anti-Semitic Bavaria was. Eventually, they had to give the Jews civil rights later in the 1800s. Boy, did the people protest. My goodness, okay? So that's what it's like when they got civil rights. Imagine what it was like before that. Bavaria is a staunchly Catholic country, and they don't want the Jews to have any rights. So here I am. I'm 20 years old. It's 1830, or thereabouts. I can stay here in Bavaria and hope that tomorrow or the day after we'll eventually get civil rights. I can be a liberal. I can, work the political process and all that. Or I can say, screw the whole thing, I'm going to America. Heck with this. Dr. Lochenkamp, as he used to say. I'm going to America, won't have any restrictions, anything like that, okay? I'm going to the land of freedom and opportunity. They knew it'd be hard. So again, I'm 20 years old, as I said before. So I have 2 good legs, I have 2 good arms. And if the disease doesn't carry me off, and Baltimore every summer had terrible plagues and people died. Old people died right and left. Because the ships in those days, they didn't know by hygiene, would come into Baltimore, and not only would people get up, so would rats, right, from over there. And then all you need is a hot Baltimore summer with no air conditioning, and all you have to do is be 80 years old, and goodbye. So this is what happened in those days. They knew it'd be hard, but they figured there's light at the end of the tunnel, because there's no restrictions. If I make it, I make it. If I'll be successful in business or something like that, I will. And there won't be any special laws saying a Jew can't be rich, or a Jew can't move here, or a Jew can't buy a house there, or any of that stuff. Now, they don't give you anything, but they don't take anything away from you. And by the way, what were the taxes in those days? No federal taxes, remember? You were not under the United States Constitution. the federal government cannot charge taxes. It's in the Constitution. In order to change that, they had to pass whatever amendment in 1913 to allow income tax. So your taxes are local, okay? Now, the Jewish immigration started slow but steady in the 1830s, picked up steam in the 1840s, became frenzied in the 1850s, then began to taper off in the 1860s and came to an end in the 1870s. That's what you're talking about, right? The 30s, the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, especially the 30s, 40s, and 50s. That's when most of the Jewish immigrants came to Baltimore and to the United States, right? This is what they mean by the German invasion. Now, it applied also to people who are not Jewish. There's a zillion German non-Jews that came over here. The street signs in Baltimore, Maryland, in the old days were in German and English. Most things were bilingual. Just read Mencken. He grew up with that. You understand? They took the signs down and changed it all in World War I. You understand? When there was such a big anti-German thing, Liberty Heights, it was German Heights. Get it? Right? And the original Shares Israel was on German Street, but then they changed it, I think, to Redwood or something like that. What? Yeah. They changed all the names all across the country. And this is the best one. Frankfurters were called Liberty Sausages. But anyway, that means if you're coming from Bavaria and you land and stay in Baltimore, Maryland, everybody's talking German. You see? The Jews came here all poor, with maybe a few bucks. Many eked out a living for their entire lives. That's what happened. But some became rich through business and hard work. I'm not talking through cheating and scams. Look at this. Philip Heidelbach, I'm trying to read it from my angle, arrived in New York in 1837. A fellow Bavarian helped him invest all of his $8 into small merchandise that bulged in a peddler's pack. At the end of 3 months, the $8 had grown to unencumbered $150 in those days, right? So in other words, how do you do this? You don't eat except once a day. You understand? You keep the same shoes, you work your head off, but you're putting together the money. Heartened by this splendid return, Heidelbach's, I'm trying to read it, headed for the Western country, peddling overland and stopping at farmhouses by night, where for the standard charge of 25 cents, you could get supper and lodging and breakfast for a quarter. In spring of that year, so notice he's heading towards the Mississippi. In the spring of that year, and by the way, it's the old America. In the countryside, there was no crime. There were farmers. You see? I mean, you could do this. And you know what a peddler is. You bring to the farmhouse stuff. There was no 4 Sears and Roebuck, right? Now, wait a second. In the spring of that year, he arrived in Cincinnati. He peddled the country within a radius of 100 miles from the source of his supply of goods, frequently traveling through Union and Liberty. These are places over there, counties in Indiana. Before the year was out, it was $2,000. Then he stopping in Chillicothe, he replenished his stock. He and another guy, Jacob Seasongood, they met up, 2 Jewish guys in other words, and the 2 men, both 25 years old, formed a partnership. They pooled their resources. For the next 2 years, they labored at peddling. In spring of 1840, now he came in 1837. They opened a dry goods store in this place in Cincinnati, and the firm Heidelbach and Seasongood. The new firm became a center for peddler supplies at once, and the business expanded. They branched into the retail clothing trade. Classic story, right? Now, nobody gave him anything, and didn't steal anything, right? That was America. You're on your own, but you keep what you made, so to speak, right? Now, just multiply the story, maybe not with that degree of instant success. That was the German Jews, okay? That was the German Jews. And by the way, the highest madrega is to have a store, because then you don't have to walk. You get it? First, you're a peddler. When you reach the right level, you can actually have a store and sit down. And when you reach a higher level, wholesaler. You don't even have to deal with retail customers. You see? Now, a generation or 2 later, they'll start the department stores. But the concentration of the business is what you see the trend was. Okay? Take, for example, John Dyer, who came here in 1812. That's early. He's Dutch. He became a butcher. What does it mean, a Jewish guy, a butcher in Baltimore, Maryland in 1812, 1813? Probably had kosher or non-kosher, because What do you do with, they didn't traber, you know what I mean? So what do? Let's assume you shechted the animal. So the front half is for the kosher and the other half is for the non-kosher. That's what they did. He prospered and then he opened a packing house. Why not? Since he was prosperous by the 1820s, he became the first president of this shul, Netzchei Yisrael, which Maryland Christians called the Baltimore Hebrew Congregation. It's not what they call themselves, right? Because you're not Jewish. You see, the Jews got some kind of thing. It's the Baltimore, and Hebrew is a polite word. You wouldn't call it the Baltimore Jew Congregation. That wasn't polite at that time. You say Hebrew or Israelite. That's the right way to talk. Now, the shul did not have a building. It meant in a rented room above a Jewish grocery store. But it was a shul and not a minyan in a guy's house. That's how they thought about it, like we're making progress. As the 1830s proceeded and more Bavarian Jews settled here, and the quarters weren't large enough, the shul moved and moved. And eventually, my goodness, they actually bought a house on High Street between Fayette and Gay. They actually got their own house. A member donated the property, actually, a 3-story house, where the shul was for 8 years. Today, you call that a shtibel or something like that. No, we were in a grocery store in a corner. Now we actually have our own house, okay? These Bavarian Jews were not learned. They came from small villages. I told you, they're not allowed to live in cities. And what they knew of Judaism was mimetic and not text-based. They could read the Chumash, the Siddur a little bit. They never heard of Shulchan Aruch. They heard of it and they didn't read it. You know what to do because you saw what your mother does on Pesach. You saw how she cleans the house. You know what you do on Purim. You know what you do on Friday night, right? There's a time long ago, Karen was teaching in Annapolis. There was Sunday school there. We're going back a while. And she couldn't make it for some reason. So I called up a cousin of mine. I said, can you substitute for him? She said, I don't know what to teach him, something like that. I said, just tell him what you do on Shabbos. You understand? You come home and you do Shalom Aleichem. They have something called Kiddush. Then you wash your hands. And then you make a motzi. It's mimetic. You don't realize how much you know compared to other people. It's sad what I say. But that's the kind of Jews that were there. Now, that's how it was in the old country. Most people were traditional because of how they grew up in small communities and just picked up what you picked up. By the way, some families got it wrong. You know what I mean? No, you have your customs. What's memory like? Raise your hand if you really remember what your grandparents actually did, so-and-so. You have a general feeling, right? There were some yeshivas in Bavaria, but they were sort of like for an elite. So Rabbi Hamburger has this wonderful 3-volume history of the yeshiva in Firth, which is near Nuremberg. Rabbi Heinemann is from Firth, and Henry Kissinger and others. So that was the Volozhin, you might say, the Yerushalayim of Bavaria. Okay. So again, in Firth and Würzburg, there were 1 or 2 places that had what we would call today serious learning. Nowhere else. Most families had their kids working already at a young age because they needed the income. So theirs was a traditionalist and a sentimental Judaism, not an intellectual one. Certainly not a Judaism of Torah scholarship. They knew what a shul was from Bavaria, not from the Shulchan Aruch. And so when they have their minions, they schnatter and they knas and all that sort of thing. You know what I'm talking about. You auction the aliyahs, because that's what you remember they did over there. And when somebody does something wrong, you give them a knas, a half a penny, 2 pennies, whatever it is, for, getting out of line. And that's how a shul is supposed to run. And they grew. They're always growing in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, and 60s. New people are shung up all the time. There was no rabbi, and the observance of the members varied greatly, just like it used to be back in the old country. Not everybody was what you call frum. They're all members of the Jewish communities. Some were a little more observant, some a little less observant. The most important frum member in the old days was Jonas Friedenwald. He kept everything, okay? Even about now, he doesn't wear a yarmulke. In the old days, he did. They were so religious that on the boat over, they almost starved because there was no kosher food, and they lived on, very little. You see, things like that. and he even got the captain of the ship in 1830 to let him have a room where he can daven and things like that. So he came over here. Now, he wasn't learned, anything like that, but very strongly traditionalistic, okay? In other words, he knows what Shabbos is, he knows what Kashrus is, and that sort of thing. And you don't have to read me from a book. This Jonas Friedmold was a Shomer Shabbos all his life. He started here, got off the boat and started fixing umbrellas as a business. Then he moved to running a grocery store. Then he became a junk dealer, and then a hardware store. And over 30 years, he was worth close to $1 million in those days. And he did it without keeping the store open on Shabbos. Went from rags to riches, right? It was actually $900,000, okay? In those days, okay? Because then he retired. And then he said, I'm going to devote my life to the synagogue and to Jewish things and all that, because he could do it. As we shall see, some of his kids remained frum for a generation or two. Herein lies the problem, which the Bavarians had no way of comprehending. They could have had no way of comprehending. Almost nobody comprehended in those days except for Samson Raphael Hirsch. And that is schools, chinuch, as we call it today. You understand? That's the name of the game. Now, I'm speaking with hindsight, and we all know this. They didn't see it at that time. Without chinuch, the traditionalism that these Bavarians brought to Baltimore with them would start to wither from the moment they landed. And that's for the parents. For the kids who grow up here, uncomprehended mimesis would hold very little attraction. Because they did this, you got to do it? Why? You understand? It's not going to work. This was the big tragedy. So in other words, they all came over fairly observant, and some very. It ain't going to last. This did not bode well. Judaism has never thrived, if indeed it survived, under such circumstances. That's an interesting historical fact I just said. Judaism has never survived, it certainly never thrived, without any education. Looking back with the wisdom of hindsight, it's a truism that if there's no limit Torah, there's no long-term survival. That's not a statement of Frumkeit. It's a fact of sociology and history. That's what we see. So it's one or the other. Baltimore was not unique in this, but in this series I'm talking about Baltimore, which is growing now as I'm speaking from 3 families to 3,000 families. Right? In the beginning, it was maybe 3 or 4 families. And now it's going to be 10,000, 12,000, 13,000 people. In addition to no serious chinuch, there was also the heady new sense of freedom coming from tyrannical Europe. You got out of a jail. No one tells me what to do. I'm an American. No rabbi can order me. He can appeal to me. That was different in Europe. In Europe, in the old country, the rabbi said, you got to do this and this and this. Not over here. That's part of what America was. Now, it's okay with me, but if the rabbi said like this, you can't open your store on Shabbos. Guys, don't tell me what I can do. Don't tell me what I can do. You see? As I said, this was true all across antebellum America. That means before the Civil War. This is what the United States looked like. And this was really the mainly inhabited part. So all the German Jews come to this. Some will go here, mainly to this. Okay? Now, in the 1840s, of course, James Knox Polk doubled the country and, they went to the West Coast. Right? That's the Mexican War, as they call it, and the Oregon Treaty. But Baltimore was a little bit different, as always has been a little bit. For before long, Baltimore community had a rabbi, a real rov, purely by accident. You see, the president of the synagogue, Nizchi Yisrael, Baltimore Hebrew congregation, went on a business trip to New York City in 1840 to buy stuff. To his surprise, he encountered somebody from his hometown little village back in Bavaria that he grew up with. Someone who had gone, unlike him, gone to an elite yeshiva, okay? In Würzburg and then in Fürth. In Bavaria, that guy became a big Talmid Chacham. And by the way, very frum, a tzaddik, a chassid in the nusach of Chasidus Ashkenaz, you know what that is. That Germanic piety, not Hasidic, Germanic. On the other hand, this guy, and he said, what are you doing in New York? And he says, this scholar was 40 years old and didn't have a job. You see, He's a victim of the yeshiva system, still there today. He wasn't from a rich family. He didn't marry the right girl. He had no yichus. He had no pull. He had no lobbyists. And he married a poor girl. He himself was a big Talmid Chacham, no question about it, but he wasn't tall, dark, and handsome. Actually, he had a pronounced limp. He wasn't a heartthrob like the Noda Yehuda was, right? The secret police report in Prague said the Noda Yehuda is a Frauengott. He's a god to the women, right? Because he was 6'2", 6'3", and tall, dark, and handsome, and all the rest of it. Not him, okay? He wasn't a great orator. He was just a big Talmid Chacham and a very righteous person with a spotless character. He came to America precisely because there were no shtetls in Europe. His Rebbeim told him, and he's 40, go to America. You'll be the chief rabbi over there. You know enough, which was true. By traditional standards, meaning, what's this traditional way of judging a rabbi? Halachic knowledge combined with utter sincerity and personal integrity. He was definitely someone who could have been a chief rabbi of America, right? He had the knowledge and the character. But come on, would any of this matter in the new American Jewry rapidly spreading all over America? They don't have no chief rabbi. Would it matter to the Jews in Baltimore? Well, he was a Bavarian, so he did speak their dialect of German Yiddish. On the other hand, he was definitely too frum for most of them. And his scholarship was not something that these rough and tumble Amoratzim could appreciate. Okay? By birth, temperament, and training, he possessed too full of a measure of the Yekisha virtues to engage in the necessary buttering up and kissing up and politicking to gain popularity among his congregants. He called them the Yekisha vices and the Yekisha virtues. I'm talking about the old Germans. If I like it, I tell you I like it. If I don't like it, I tell you I don't like it. So, I like that dress. I don't like that dress. Now I know where you stand. Instead of saying, I like it, and as soon as she leaves the room, you say, can you believe that? You know, how's it go? Rashi's wife comes home one day with a new dress, a pink dress. She says, what do you think? He says, it doesn't really flatter you. She said, Rashi, you have to have a comment on everything. That's who he was. So he couldn't say like this, oh, you're nice. He's like this, are you keeping Shabbos? Yep. Where you buy your food? Do you have tzitzis on? Because that's the way it was once upon a time, okay? So you can look at it as a plus, you can look at it as a minus. Coming from his background, which was the elite Torah world of Bavaria in its last glory era, before the Reformed Jews got the Bavarian government closed down the yeshivas. That's what happened. So he was shocked at the wasteland in America, okay? It wasn't like the old country. Finally, he didn't speak English, not for a while, and so he lost the young who were already speaking English. Here's Isaac Leeser, who was one of the most prominent American Jews in Philadelphia. He published the Jewish Times of America, let's call it that, which was called the Occident. No, it's not the Orient, but the Occident. You get it? And it's very interesting. A lot of it's online. And he really tried to be the Jewish Times of America. So any kind of news that was in a community, they would send him, they would publish it. And if you're an English-speaking American Jew, that's the newspaper you get. You understand? All over the country, you know, Baltimore, Maine, Shreveport, Texas. That's what it is. He was a frum guy. He was actually the nephew of that guy, Zalman Ryan. And he wasn't a rabbi, but by the American standards, he was a rabbi. Although he never pretended. And he was very, how should I put it? Also was a Yakisha person. And so you should see, how should I put it? He says, Baltimore, they have a new rabbi, and he's great, and he's big, and I send all my shilas to him, all the rest of it. You got to learn English, because the young generation, you give a drasha, a sermon in German, you immediately, all the kids walk out. And you can just close your eyes and see it. I don't understand the word he's saying. Wait a minute, your parents come from Germany. Yes, I know 5 words. Like many of us remember with Yiddish, okay? I actually learned Yiddish, but a lot of my contemporaries, they know a little bit here, a little bit there. Imagine, therefore, an Israeli, Haredi, Yiddish-speaking Rav here in their Talmud. The shul's a good shul, the rabbi's a good rabbi, it's not a good shidduch. That's not what they want here, okay? A Yiddish-speaking Israeli. So Baltimore had a funny situation. You had a major rabbinical scholar, a posek, as we would say today, the wrong shul in the wrong community. I'm being a little too harsh here. To make up a Baltimore Jewry, which was unplanned and spontaneous, based on uncontrolled and unregulated immigration. They didn't say who gets in. Whoever came, came. This Jewry was variegated. There definitely was a group, certainly not very large, of genuinely frum immigrants and families. That's probably layman's ancestors. And they clicked with Rabbi Rice. And, they sent the shalos to him and all that, like in the old days. These were families who, like the others, set up small stores and businesses, slowly worked their way up to solid middle-class status, remaining Shomer Shabbos. Indeed, the mark of the Shomer Shabbos was you have your own business so you can't get fired. That's what it was, okay? But remember, can't open on Sunday. They had the blue laws. It's a Christian state. So if you close on Saturday, you're losing an extra day of business, right? Which wasn't simple when, like I said before, all your money comes in from what you make. That's why in the old days, especially in this era, Saturday night, the winter, as soon as Shabbat is over, it's over like 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock, you go open the store. Nothing wrong with that, and you had to do it, okay? This small group was close with the new rabbi, and they davened with him in his private home. You see, the new synagogue building that they built was for Shabbos and holidays and perhaps yard sites. They didn't even have Sunday services because all the peddlers had to hit the road on Sunday and get to where you're going, be out of town by Monday. You understand? And then you have to work it out that you come back in time, you know what I'm saying. So what about if you want to daven during the week? So the rabbi had around the corner, he had a minyan in his own house. But aside from this loyalist base, most of the members of the shul were not like this. I mean, I'm sure they bought from kosher butcher. I'm sure the ladies bench licht on Friday night, like they saw in the old country. But they kept their stores and businesses open on Saturdays, certainly Saturday afternoon when shul's over, right? They didn't keep kosher when they're on the road, things like that. And remember, right, new members were joining all the time, getting off the boat. Above all, there was a profound and tragic disconnect of historical proportions between Rabbi Rice and the Baal Batim over the question of chinuch, because he saw the reality with crystal clarity, and they saw nothing. And from the very first speeches, he said, we got to make a school, we got to make a high school, and then a post-high school. If you want your children to stay Jewish, if you want your children and grandchildren to take your place, they didn't see it. What a pity. You could have had T.A., Beis Yaakov, Ner Israel, all that back in the 1840s and 50s. It could have happened, right? My goodness, what would Baltimore look like today? Let me tell you something, it's not what you think. Baltimore would look more like Frankfurt than like Vilna, right? Because it would have been, quote unquote, the Hirsch type orthodoxy. You could have a high school, and they could even, the money was there. You could even have, quote unquote, a YU or something like that in Baltimore, Maryland, in the middle of the 19th century, a little bit later. And the tone of this community would be different, you see? But they didn't see it that way, and they had no imagination. And their imagination was directed entirely towards their own financial successes, which was completely understandable but tragic. Yeah? In other words, everything depends on putting food on the table and putting away a little nest egg. I mean, I get it. But they had no time to devote attention to Jewish stuff. You see, that's the difference between the Jews and the Catholics. Catholics came to this country and started assimilating, and the public schools were all very Protestant. They read from the Martin Luther Bible and things like King James Bible. And intermarriage. Irish guys getting off the boat marrying Protestant girls. It's terrible. But the Catholic Church has a priesthood. That's people, their whole vocation is to devote themselves entirely to the interests of the church. so they could give a thought to it, whereas the Jews are thinking about putting bread on the table. And they came up with what I'm talking about, day schools and yeshivas. As you know, they created an entire parallel Catholic education system from kindergarten to Georgetown, to Fordham, Notre Dame. It's legal. And you get a good secular education, but you also get the Catholic stuff. Jews could have done the same thing. Wasn't illegal in this country, but they weren't thinking along those lines. So it was mimesis and decadence instead of chinuch and growth. That's the heart of the matter. The little things, like the clash over aliyahs from Mechal Shabbos, the rabbis say you can't give an aliyah to somebody who's Mechal Shabbos, and if they did, they say you can't say Amen, and they said Amen, little things. Or the crazy Masonic funeral rituals, which led Hutzler and company to secede and form the Har Sinai, because one of their group died, and it was in the Masons, or whatever it was. I think it was the Masons. And they have all the rituals, right? And imagine Rabbi Rice would say, what the heck is this, right? He's supposed to have tachrichim, and they were so outraged that he dares butt into their funeral that they said, we're leaving the shul. That's how the Har Sinai started. Hutzler was the leader, right? Har Sinai is now deceased. I'm talking about at that time. They were simply symptoms of what I'm talking about. I could give you other stories, but the trend is what I want you to apprehend. Meanwhile, the shul grew to the point where by 1845, they could build the handsome Lloyd Street Synagogue, okay? So it's not gigantic, but it's not a minion in a grocery store. I mean, when they built that, they must have thought, this is something else, okay? Because it's a shul with the pillars and all the rest of it. But the laity was sufficiently grubbed as to offer the position of rabbi to Isaac Leeser and Samuel Isaacs, and at a higher salary. In other words, when they had the dedication, and this is all in the Occident, you can see it online. 1845, they had the dedication, so big speakers came. Isaac Leeser, I told you, from Philadelphia, editor of the Occident. He was a chazan in the shul in Philly. And Samuel Isaacs was a chazan in the Dutch synagogue in Manhattan. And these are two religious guys. And they came and they gave, addresses for the occasion. And the German Jews like, oh, you speak better English than our rabbi. How would you like to take the job? Okay? So talk about a grubber young. You know what I'm saying? At the shul dedication, they offered another guy. Now they declined. They said like this. We send him our shilas, He's the big guy over here. But it goes to show you it wasn't a good shidduch. You can see the kind of jerks the Balabashim were. Anyway, as the 1840s unfolded and more Jews immigrated and joined the shul, the rabbi became more and more frustrated. He harangued them from the pulpit, but had no effect. Actually had the opposite effect, because Americans don't like criticism. So it's a bad shidduch. You see, in a really frum shul, it's the job of the rabbi to criticize the people, and it's the job of the people to take it. That doesn't mean they listen, right? But a rabbi can get up and give them hell, you're too much talking in shul, right? Now, they listen or they don't listen. That's a long history of that. But he's got the right to say it. Not only is it right, he's a duty. You see? People are coming too late to davening, or the kashrus isn't this and that and the other, and, and the heck with all of you. This has gone for 1,000 years, right? Look, it goes back to Moshe Rabbeinu. He harangues the people, he gives them a tochacha. That doesn't mean they listen, right? Now in America, it's a new story. You can't do that in a Protestant church. You can't criticize me, you see? So it's bad shidduch. At the same time, nobody disputed Rabbi Rice's rectitude. Nobody said he was underhand or anything like that. Nobody could challenge his scholarship, because every day in Baltimore, shilas came from all over the states, and even from the West Indies. And the two newspapers, the Occident and the Jewish Messenger out of New York, praised him always to the skies. They said, oh, is Baltimore lucky? We have such a great scholar. He could actually be the chief rabbi of the whole United States, blah, blah, blah. So you tell one of the Balabatim, they say, Travelers, also this guy, Benjamin II, he's a Polish Yid. He went all over the United States in the 1840s. And he describes, you can get the book, probably it's online, Travels of Benjamin II. You see, the original guy is Benjamin of Tudela, back in the 1100s. So he calls himself Benjamin II. It's a shtick. But the point is that he's telling you what's going on in Richmond, in New York. He comes to Baltimore. He said, Baltimore has a big Talmud Chacham over here. Oh, my goodness. And I was surprised to see him in America. All the rest. So everybody said like this. So the shul couldn't fire him. They wouldn't dare. But he quit. In 1849, he was a man of principle. I told you he had the Yekish vices, right? You can't stand this business. He didn't care about his loss of income. And he fought over piyutim. They want to start changing the piyutim because he said it's a slippery slope. Once you get rid of the piyutim, which is the extra davening, next thing there'll be this, and next thing there'll be this, which is not wrong. I mean, that's how it went in Germany. The reforms in the synagogues didn't start overnight. Let's have Michal Shabbos or a non-Jewish choir. It started with little things. So he said, if they won't listen to me on this, I quit. He moved to Howard Street, which is west. He opened a grocery store. Okay? I'm sure it didn't bring him a good living. He brought his existing minion there. And now they just had a minion there 7 days a week in his house. It's his Hasidim versus the freed malls of the others who were from, but they said, we want to stay in the shul and try to affect it here. After all, we paid for a lot of the building. You see? And we don't want the shul to be taken out of our hands. So both groups respected him, but one, I guess, let's call it seceded, the other one did not. Over the next decade, now I'm up to the 1850s, the decade before the Civil War, Reform Judaism hits Baltimore, and it would come to divide the entire community. Religiously, not socially. They were divided over religious matters, not over social intercourse, interestingly. The German Jews would stay a tribe, which is a very interesting story. Excuse me. Here's a point to stell on, as they say. Today, in 20th century, 21st century in Baltimore, religious differences among Baltimore Jews have led to a cold divorce between the two religious segments of the Baltimore Jewish community. It's not good, but it's what it is. It still does. In modern Baltimore, there live two Jewish communities side by side. They're both formally polite and civil, but they've sort of socially excommunicated each other, and they live separate Jewish lives in the same city and metropolitan area. So really, they're two Jewish Baltimores. Remember, the Associated had a sign, "We are one," right? And that's certainly true. But I remember, before the Jewish Times went under, or whatever it is, the guy said, actually, we're two. Because there really are two separate communities, and it's a divorce. You understand? Now, it's not good, but it's the way it is. That was not the case. So what I mean to say is like this. I don't usually visit Reform services. Usually it's not going to be at my wedding, at my bar mitzvah, my siyum. It's not going to happen. And the other way around. That was not true of the German Jews, especially in the 19th century. This one could be in the Har Sinai. His brother could be in the Sheretz Israel. Another could be in the Chizuk Emunah. And they would marry each other and visit each other. And, you had to make allowances for food and things like that. But over religious matters, a big divide, starting in the 1850s. Okay? Interestingly, this did not happen in the 19th century among the Baltimore German Jews. There were sharp divisions and disputes between Reform versus Orthodox, with strong feelings on both sides. Nevertheless, the two factions associated with each other, socialized with each other, attended each other's simchas, married each other, and as time went on, after 1870, a lot of people had memberships in both the Orthodox and Reform synagogues, with family members buried in different cemeteries, and there were wonderful inconsistencies down into the 20th century, with some Reform Jews keeping kosher and observing aspects of Shabbos, and there were Orthodox Jews that ate out in non-kosher restaurants, right? That's what it was. I mean, in the Sheretz Israel and the Har Sinai and all the rest of it. Now, in other words, the German Jews really felt themselves to be members of a club. It's called the Club of Baltimore German Jews. They were often related. They came from the same villages back in Germany. They were in the same types of business. They had the same German language, or the same dialects, if you want, the German Yiddish, the same foods, the same sense of humor. We'll talk about more of this in the next lecture. The same intense desire to Americanize and to prosper. In other words, to acculturate. The Reformed Jews, you couldn't imagine something like today that you want to give education in Yiddish. So, no, We want the English, you see? The Reformed Jews were even eager to acculturate in their Judaism. That's what set them apart from the Orthodox. The Reform wanted to Americanize Judaism itself, and that meant making it more Protestant. Hence, the many reforms in the synagogue architecture and services that start in the 1850s. No mechitza, no bima, organs, non-Jewish choirs, and eventually he changed the siddur to leave out Tzion, Chesed Mason, things like that. Between 1849 and 1859, rabbis started coming to America in large numbers. The great majority of them are rabbis, only in quotes. They didn't have smicha. They just pretended to. But America was the headquarters of P.T. Barnum. You understand? What they used to call this? Humbug. It's the land of humbug, which nowadays we use a different term I can't say in Shul. The great majority didn't have smicha. They pretend to. After all, who's to know? Yeah, the famous story from later of the Mashol who came to Galveston much later. And he came to a shul there, from Eastern Europe. And he said, who's the rabbi? Oh, we have a big rabbi over here. He has smicha from the Chavetz Chaim. It's in his office. He said, I never even heard the Chavetz Chaim ever gave anybody smicha. And when he came to rabbi, for money and all, he looks on the thing on the board and it says like this, get out of my yeshiva, you bum, I never want to see you again. This and the other, signed, Yisrael Meir Cohen of Radin. Well, who's going to read it? You understand? So I can tell you right now, the 1850s and 60s were full of these types. Late 1840s, 50s, and 60s. Isaac Mayer Wise becomes the number one rabbi in America. He'll be the effective organizer of Reformed Judaism in this country. He's what made it successful. He never knew smicha. He went to to use modern terminology, he went to the Bechina. You understand? He went to a little senior high school type yeshiva in Bohemia for a while. But in America, if you can read Hebrew and read a little more than that, and if you can understand the Mishnayos here or there, you're already the Vilna Gaon. That's how it worked. In antebellum America, not in Baltimore, local communities didn't care. Can the guy lead a service? Can he perform a wedding and a funeral? Can he make a speech? Does he look presentable to our non-Jewish neighbors? He's a rabbi. In fact, too frum is problematic. Such a person is going to criticize opening stores on Saturday. Better someone who'll preach on Judaism, right? Or what they used to call verbal bouquets. Kulach yafaraya simu mebach. You're all wonderful. You're all perfect. You Jewish communities of Clarksdale, Mississippi, of Shreveport, Louisiana. You're great. You understand? And that way you get a job. So the Baltimore Hebrew after Rabbi Rice, they got a guy, Henry Hochheimer. He didn't have smicha. The guy who gave him the smicha was a Reform rabbi, Alb. Right? But he's good enough. Har Sinai got a rabbi. Well, they got Einhorn, who actually was a graduate of the yeshiva, but then he turned 180 degrees. So he knew how to learn, but boy, did he go left. Right? Tamachak and Shona Pirish. Einhorn brings to Baltimore, and remember, this is a community of peddlers, of merchants, of storekeepers, pants pressers, as they say. He brings a philosophical conception of Reformed Judaism. It's up to date in an era when fundamentalism is untenable and nomianism is obsolete. This is the time of Charles Darwin. And so you really believe all those Bible stories, let alone, the Talmud and this kind of stuff. Now, he says you should keep Shabbos because it's a Jewish thing. Interesting. But kashrus let me put it this way, they're on purpose against nomianism. They say it's not part of the Jewish religion. That's what Reformed Judaism started as. You couldn't directly attack fundamentalism. You couldn't say there's no God. Because this was a Protestant country. You could attack nomianism. So the Bible's laws and rituals are all out of date. So in the Baltimore 1850s, there was the Har Sinai with extreme and doctrinaire reform. There was the Minyan at Rabbi Rice's house with extreme Orthodox, and the Baltimore Hebrew congregation with a conflicted membership, fighting all the time which direction should the congregation go. The board meetings don't ask, okay? So, what about conservative, what you and I would call conservative Judaism? Well, it didn't come to America yet, formally till 1900, but the type of Baal Batim that were attracted to that kind of approach we call conservative, they made Ohab Shalom. That's what that is. Now, the shul changed later, but in the beginning, for the first 40 years, is what you and I would call conservative. Was it left-wing Orthodox? Was it right-wing Reform? They wouldn't even like to ask that question, you see? But its members liked that approach. And they hired a graduate from the Breslau Seminary. That was when the JTS was brand new in Germany, in Breslau. Zachary Frankel was the big opponent of Hirsch. In other words, let's put it this way. These are the two guys who represent two different models of modern Orthodoxy. Here's what we would call a from modern Orthodoxy, and him was what we call a traditional modern Orthodoxy. And this is Rice. He started out in the yeshiva in Pressburg of the Ksav Sofer. He ended up elsewhere, and in Frankel's Jewish Theological Seminary. He comes to Baltimore, I think he was 28 years old, and he learned how to give a speech, and he knows how to learn, you know what I'm saying, somewhat. I mean, he did have real training, but what is your position on synagogue reforms and rituals, all the rest of it? Ad Moshe and Postkal on Shei Sipim. As Eliyahu said, how long are you going to stand on two roads? In other words, you have one foot planted on the road to Chicago, you have another foot planted on the road to Miami. Which direction are you going? On the one hand, Rabbi Zold and his daughter is Henrietta Zold, right? Rabbi Zold supported Shmir Shabbos and Kashrus, the old Avshal. On the other hand, he mutilated, he castrated the siddur. He gave his own siddur out. We cut right and left and added this and the other. You should see what they have on Tisha B'Av. Oh, no longer do we mourn the temple because, oh Lord, you have now made America the temple and you have scattered us in the world for our benefit of mankind and blah, 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 blah. This kind of stuff. It's called Avodas Yisrael. It was a famous siddur for a while, for 30, 40 years, and then it went out of business because the Reform siddur knocked it out. It was called the Zold Jastrow siddur because Marcus Jastrow in Philadelphia and Zold were friends. They're both conservative, as you and I would say today. On the one, so which is it? Like conservative Judaism in the 20th century, this middle-of-the-road approach worked for a generation or two. But then the shul eventually went totally Reform, classical Reform in 1890. They retired the rabbi. There was only 61. But they said, you're retired, we're giving you a nice pension, provided you don't make trouble. And then they went all the way to the left. Although, to tell you the truth, traditionalism lasts long in Baltimore. And I remember I was friend with Joe Shavrick, had the butcher shop here, the kosher butcher in the 30s, and he said that he used to announce from the pulpit in Ohab Shalom, his time, Rabbi Rosenau, which butchers are kosher this week, which one are not. In a temple like that. See, they still had old members, you know. Anyway, so Baltimore's having all the different types. Eventually, after the Civil War, the Baltimore Hebrew congregation went Reform, totally Reform. Although again, there were a fair amount of members who continued to be observant, one degree or another. You see, the vote was like, let's say, for example, 60 to 40, something like that. Of the 40 who lose, either you secede and make your own shul, or you just say, I'm so attached to this shul, I'll even be there with the new Reform services, but I still, like candles on Friday night, we still buy from Kosher Butcher, and we still keep this and that and the other. Now, that won't last more than a generation. But Baltimore was an interesting place in the 19th century in that way, in the early 20th century. But that was later. Before the Civil War, the congregation, the Baltimore Hebrew congregation, the Lloyd Street Shul, was divided into factions. This reflected the mood of the general German Jewish community here. People just disagreed over Jewish things. Siblings, relatives, business partners, they fought it out. That's the way things were. From our perspective today, the whole thing was kind of doomed. Because what were they fighting over? Synagogue rituals, Siddurim, things like that. That's not where the future is at. Non-observance of Taras Mishpacha, Shabbos, Kashrus. These happen on their own, not because of Reform. Because my Mises withered, as I told you before. Nobody was interested in serious chinuch except Rabbi Rice, and I told you, nobody listened to him. Was there money here? Yeah. You could have supported schools. No feeling. right? There's no feeling. It's late, and we've only scratched the surface, but I think before we get into Civil War, we'll call it a night and start next time.